Hello, everybody. With this presentation, you will deepen your knowledge about the roles of cultural mediators in educational contexts. So you will expand your knowledge and your information about what is possible to do with cultural mediators in multilingual and intercultural educational contexts in particular. So repeating what I already mentioned in another PPT about cultural mediation in general, I would like to remind you that cultural mediation is a necessary service in order to provide interacting subjects with an effective communication across languages and in order to facilitate the access to and the exercise of emerging bilinguals' language rights in contexts where their heritage language is not the dominant one. So as you can see, cultural mediation is very important in different social contexts. And specifically here, since we are dealing with educational contexts, I mean that I would like to underline that mediation is very important, both from a political point of view, in order to facilitate the access to language rights by emerging bilinguals, and also from an educational point of view. In order to reinforce the presence of plural multilingual repertoires in educational settings. As I mentioned once again in the previous presentation about cultural mediation in general, different domains are involved in cultural mediation, and specifically also in cultural mediation in educational contexts, including interpersonal communication, so communication in general, and also situated communication, language policy, both from a bottom-up and from a top-down point of view, ethnography, stressing on the subjectivity of mediators and on the situational dimension of mediation, and of course also multilingualism and interculturality. So now I would like to provide you with the three main characteristics and main functions of professional cultural mediators in educational contexts. I would like to stress on the instrumental function that cultural mediators might play in such contexts, on what I call the symbolic function, and on a socio-political function. So starting from the first one, the instrumental function is understood as the function played by mediators in the first welcome of emergent bilingual pupils at school. So this instrumental function is very important in order to provide emergent bilinguals from the very beginning with language support and language rights when they start to attend the educational context in which they have to socialize with their peers. So the presence of mediators in schools and in educational contexts in general is very important from the very beginning in order to welcome as well as possible newly arrived children, as well as emerging bilingual pupils in general. Then there is also a symbolic function, which is understood as a support provided by mediators in order to implement multilingual education. As I said, generally speaking, also in the other general presentation about mediation, mediators can act as a support to the implementation of multilingual education at school. This does not mean that mediators have to substitute teachers, but they can be a very important support in order to engage multilingual repertoires in class. So mediators can facilitate the access to multilingual repertoires in class, dealing with different languages and acting across languages, linking knowledges of students in class and facilitating the access to, for example, metalinguistic awareness, as well as to language exchanges between peers in class. And there is also a broad socio-political function of mediators which involves, of course, educational contexts, but it is not limited just to educational contexts. And by socio-political function, I mean that mediators can act as facilitators of the exercise of language rights, especially at school. They can be a very important professional profile which encourages the exercise of language rights in a view of equality and in a view of complete engagement of multilingual repertoires and different languages at school, despite the presence of a mainstream language, which is the language of schooling. As I can show you from this example, I can show an example which links together the three dimensions, the instrumental one, the symbolic one, and the socio-political one. This example is drawn from a mediation carried out in class during a storytelling activity in Italy, in an Italian school, where a Chinese parent was invited in order to narrate a story from his childhood to the rest of the class. As you can see, the parent is Chinese and he speaks Chinese and is not proficient enough in Italian in order to translate the contents of his story in Italian. So for this reason, there is a mediator that who translates the contents from Chinese to Italian, but from a creative point of view. What do I mean by creative mediation? I mean that the mediator translates contents of the narration mainly in Italian, but not only in Italian, because he also leaves some words and brief expressions in Chinese. So he leaves some words and brief expressions untranslated. What's the purpose of this? There is a double purpose. On the one side, he allows to keep non-Chinese students' interest high towards words and sentences in Chinese. So in this way, non-Chinese students can ask their Chinese peers about translations of specific words which are not translated by the mediators. And on the other side, the mediator encourages Chinese students to provide their mates with linguistic supports and brief translations. So the symbolic function is the one which involves the mediator as a facilitator to the access of a bilingual repertoire in this case, which is composed by Italian and Chinese, and to move dynamically, in a dynamic way, from one language to another. So the symbolic function is a function which sees the mediator as an important support to multilingual education. And the socio-political function is a further function which is played by the mediator in this case, because he encourages Chinese pupils to give voice to their home language in Italian mainstream education. So he encourages and he supports the exercise of language rights and the full engagement of bilingual repertoires in this case. So he promotes bilingualism, even if in an educational setting where there is a dominant language which is standard Italian, but where there is also space for other languages. And this space, such a space, can be empowered by teachers, of course, by pupils and their families, but also by professional profiles like mediators who act in class as facilitators to the access of linguistic repertoires. Looking at this interaction with the background of the CFR companion volume, we can conceive mediation in this case also from a communicative and from a conceptual point of view, because the mediator acts in a communicative perspective. So he facilitates translinguistic interaction between pupils and between the teacher and her pupils. And there is also a conceptual mediation, because thanks to the role of the mediator, different pupils can reflect on the meaning of words in Chinese, conceptualizing them in Italian, and looking at differences and similarities between words and expressions in Chinese and in Italian. So this was possible just because there was the presence of a professional mediator. In these cases, the presence of a professional mediator is strongly recommended because just because a professional mediator is also an expert of communication, and mainly an expert of communication, and he can, in this way, creatively supporting translinguistic interaction. As I mentioned before, however, there can be also other possible cultural mediators in educational contexts who are not professional mediators and who can be conceptualized as informal mediators. Teachers themselves can be understood as cultural mediators because teachers can act as facilitators themselves of translinguistic interactional practices in class, and they can reshape their interaction and their interaction patterns in order to facilitate the engagement of the multilingual repertoires in their class. And of course, another practice which has been so far not very much investigated by mainstream research is what is called language brokering, which consists into peer-to-peer mediation among pupils, but only if guided and supervised by teachers. If you would like to know something more about both aspects, you can consult these references here both about teachers as cultural mediators and about language brokering, which is a very, very important process in order to make pupils responsible from a translation point of view and from a mediation point of view towards their peers and towards their social context in class. Thank you very much for watching this video.